Okay, so today we're going deep on something that's super important, but maybe not something everyone thinks about right away when it comes
Mhm.
to medications. We're talking about what happens after a drug gets the green light, after it's approved, and actually starts being used by patients out in the real world.
Right, because it's not like, okay, approved, done, safe forever.
Right,
Right.
exactly. And thankfully, there are these systems in place to make sure things stay as safe as possible, even after a drug is out there being prescribed and taken. And that's what we're going to dig into today. We're
Mhm.
focusing specifically on drug labels, the info that comes with your meds, risk management plans, which take a bigger picture approach, and then something called REMS, which stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. These are kind of like specialized safety protocols for certain medications. You gave us some really interesting sources to work with for this deep dive.
Yeah, we've got material that touches on a whole bunch of stuff, like how drugs actually work in the body. That's your pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, all the way to the legal and regulatory side of things, with excerpts from the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR.
Yeah, all super important stuff. And even though we don't have a source that's like Chapter 1, Labeling. Chapter 2, Risk Management. Chapter 3, RMS. All these different pieces really underscore how complex drug behavior can be and how we need robust systems to catch any potential problems, even those that maybe don't show up until a drug is being used more widely.
Absolutely. It's all about creating layers of safety to protect patients.
So let's start with something we've all seen, the drug label. We might not give it a ton of thought, but it plays a huge role in medication safety. One of the excerpts you shared, the one from the Certified Pharmaceutical GMP Professional Handbook, it really dives into the nitty-gritty of packaging and labeling regulations. Like,
Mhm.
did you know there are specific guidelines for what needs to be on those cartons and inserts that come with your meds?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's
Yeah.
all laid out pretty clearly.
And it's not just like, the brand name and what the drug is for. We're talking really important stuff like how to take it properly, the correct dosage, when it expires, all that good stuff. And then there's 21 CFR 211.132, which I got to admit, I didn't know about until reading through these sources.
Yeah, that one's kind of a behind-the-scenes safety hero, right?
It is. It mandates that most over-the-counter meds have to have tamper-evident packaging. That little seal you have to break to get into the bottle. Seems so basic, but it's a huge deal.
Oh, yeah, that little seal is your first line of defense. It's a clear visual indicator letting you know, hey, no one's messed with this medication since it was packaged. It helps ensure that what you're taking is exactly what it's supposed to be, nothing's been tampered with. But the label goes way beyond just that initial physical protection. It's the main way that important info about the drug is communicated both to the patient and the healthcare provider. And what's really fascinating is that it's not just a one and done kind of thing. It's a constantly evolving document. You have to think of the label as an ongoing safety bulletin for the drug. As more data comes in, from patients actually using it in the real world, the label can get updated to reflect any new safety info that comes to light. It's a living document, really.
Wow, I never thought of it that way, like a living document. And that makes so much sense because you learn so much more once a drug is actually being used by lots of people in all sorts of different situations.
Yeah.
But okay, so the label is the first point of contact for safety info, but it sounds like there's even more going on behind the scenes to keep things safe. And that's where risk management plans come in.
Right. Risk management plans are taking a wider view, being more proactive. They're about looking at the entire lifespan of a drug, trying to anticipate any potential risks that might pop up, not just what we know right when it's approved. It's a very systematic way to approach it. It involves identifying anything that could potentially go wrong, figuring out how likely it is to happen and how serious it could be, and then coming up with strategies to minimize those risks as much as possible.
So it's like having a plan for what-if scenarios.
Exactly. And thinking back to the source material you provided, there's a really powerful example of why this kind of big picture thinking is so critical. It's the story of mipafordil.
Oh yeah, Posicor. That one stuck with me. If I remember correctly, it was approved for treating high blood pressure and chest pain, but then it was pulled from the market. That was a really big deal.
It was. And the reason it was pulled was because it turned out to be a very potent inhibitor of a specific enzyme in the body called CYP3A4. And that led to some really dangerous interactions with other drugs that people were taking at the same time.
Yeah, the evaluation of drug candidates for preclinical development source goes into that whole issue. And it's scary because they kept having to update the label with more and more warnings, but even that wasn't enough to keep people safe in the end.
No, it wasn't. The mipifriddle case is a perfect example of how, even with all the testing that happens before a drug is approved, you can still have unforeseen problems once it's out in the real world. What seemed relatively safe in clinical trials, where things are very controlled, ended up causing serious issues once it was prescribed more widely and people were taking it along with other medications. And that's a really important lesson about the limitations of what we can know before a drug is actually being used by a large population.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder.
Absolutely. And to your point, they initially put warnings on the label about interactions with a handful of specific drugs, but then reports started coming in about dangerous, sometimes even fatal interactions with at least 25 other medications. And a lot of those were really common drugs like antibiotics and antihistamines. It basically became impossible to try to address all of those potential interactions just through warnings on the label.
Wow, that's really unsettling. And it makes it clear why understanding how drugs behave in the body is so important for managing risk. And that's something that comes up over and over again in the sources you shared.
Right, like how drugs are metabolized by those CYP450 enzymes. There's a whole section on that in Fundamentals of Medicinal Chemistry. And then the role of drug transporters, that's covered in drug interactions. And then on top of all that, you have individual patient variability, how people process drugs differently based on their genetics and other factors. That's all part of what makes risk management so complex.
So, okay, risk management is about trying to anticipate these broader issues and having a game plan, right? But what about those situations where a drug has some really significant risks, even if the potential benefits are still considered greater than those risks? That's where REMS come in.
Exactly. REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies, are like an extra layer of safety that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, can require for certain drugs. These are situations where, yes, the drug has been shown to have real benefits for treating serious conditions, but there are also some pretty serious potential downsides that need to be managed very carefully to make sure the benefits outweigh the risks.
So it's all about weighing the pros and cons and finding ways to make sure the benefits win out.
Right. You want to make sure people can access treatments that can really improve their lives, but you also have to minimize the chances of them experiencing harm.
Okay, so REMS provide a structured approach to doing that. It's not just about adding more warnings to the label, right?
Right. REMS go beyond the label and can include a whole toolbox of different strategies depending on the specific risks of the drug.
Interesting. What kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, one common component of REMS is something called a medication guide. It's basically an easy-to-understand information sheet that's given directly to the patient, and it explains the serious risks associated with the medication in very clear language. It also tells them what precautions to take and how to use the medication safely. It's like a patient-friendly companion to the more technical info on the label.
That makes sense. So it's kind of like a user manual.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Then you also have REMS components that focus on communicating with healthcare providers.
Oh, right, because they're the ones actually prescribing the medications.
Exactly. So there might be letters sent directly to doctors, articles published in medical journals, or educational materials provided by the drug manufacturer. All of these are aimed at making sure that prescribers are up to date on the latest safety information and that they know how to counsel their patients appropriately.
It sounds like it's really about making sure everyone is on the same page.
Exactly. And then in some cases, REMS can include things like restricted distribution systems. This is when a drug is only available through certain certified pharmacies or only to patients who meet certain specific criteria and are enrolled in a special registry.
Wow, so it can get pretty intense.
Yeah, for drugs with really serious risks, you need more than just information. You need to control access. And then sometimes there are also monitoring requirements. This could mean that patients have to have regular blood tests or other types of checkups while they're taking the medication to make sure everything is okay. All these different components work together to support safe use of the medication after it's been approved.
So it's really about tailoring the safety measures to the specific risks of each individual drug.
Precisely. It's about being targeted and strategic, not just a one-size-fits-all approach.
It sounds like there's a big emphasis on getting the right information to the right people at the right time, both for patients and for healthcare professionals. So how does that actually work? How do you make sure the message about risks is communicated effectively?
Well, like we were talking about before, the drug label is the foundation. It's the first place a doctor or pharmacist is going to look for information about dosing, contraindications, which means when the drug shouldn't be used, and any potential side effects. But when a REM is in place, the communication efforts are kicked up a notch. You've got those medication guides that we were talking about, which are designed to clearly and directly inform the patient about the risks involved. And then there are a bunch of ways to get the info to healthcare providers. Letters, medical journal articles, educational materials. It's all about keeping them in the loop about the latest safety findings and making sure they have what they need to educate their patients.
It makes sense to have different approaches for different audiences.
Oh, absolutely. Patients and doctors have different needs and different levels of understanding when it comes to medical information.
Okay, so communicating the risks up front is essential, but then there's the whole process of monitoring patient safety once a drug is out in the world and being used by a much larger population. That must be a huge undertaking.
It definitely is. Post-approval safety surveillance is an ongoing, continuous process. It involves collecting and analyzing reports of any adverse events that occur.
Adverse events, meaning
Adverse events were basically any unexpected or harmful reactions that someone might experience while taking a medication.
so it's like keeping track of any bad side effects that crop up.
Exactly. And those reports can come from patients, from doctors, even from the drug manufacturer themselves. And the FDA, they play a critical role here, as you can see from the CFR excerpts. They're constantly monitoring all of this data that's coming in, looking for any red flags or trends that maybe weren't obvious during the clinical trials. Remember, clinical trials only involve a limited number of people, but once a drug is approved, it's being used by thousands, even millions of people. So it's really important to keep tabs on what's happening.
And that monitoring can lead to changes in how a drug is used or even whether it's available at all, right?
It can, and it does. Based on the data they're getting from post-approval surveillance, the FDA might decide that a drug label needs to be updated to include new warnings, or they might implement a new REMS, or in really extreme cases, if the risks are just too great, they might even pull a drug from the market altogether. That's what happened with mibafidil, which we were talking about earlier.
So basically, the FDA is constantly evaluating new information and making adjustments to keep people as safe as possible.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the main ways that drug safety is managed in the long term. It's a never-ending process of learning and adapting.
One of the sources you gave me, the one on developing solid oral dosage forms, mentioned something called post-approval changes and supplements to approved applications.
Oh, yeah. Those are the formal mechanisms for making changes to how a drug is manufactured, labeled, or even used based on the data that comes in after it's been approved. It could be something as simple as revising the wording on the label, or it could be a more significant change to the manufacturing process.
It really highlights how much is happening behind the scenes to keep medications safe. It's not just a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Not at all. It's a very dynamic process, constantly evolving, and this is where the science really comes into play. All the stuff we were talking about earlier, pharmacology, toxicology, pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, all of that knowledge helps us understand how a drug works in the body, how it interacts with other substances, and what the potential risks might be.
Right, so it's not just about regulations for the sake of having regulations. It's about using scientific knowledge to make informed decisions about safety.
Exactly. Understanding a drug's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, that's what ADME stands for, as well as its specific effects on the body, those are all essential pieces of the puzzle. And the regulatory frameworks, like the CFR, they provide the structure and the specific requirements for how we translate that scientific knowledge into concrete actions to make sure drugs are used as safely as possible.
It's a really cool partnership between science and regulation, all working together to protect patients. So for everyone listening, the key takeaway here is that ensuring drug safety doesn't stop once a medication is approved. It's an ongoing process. Drug labeling provides vital information. Risk management plans take a broader, proactive approach to try to anticipate and prevent potential problems. And REMS offer targeted strategies for managing the risks associated with specific medications. All these efforts are interconnected and work together to protect public health.
And I think this deep dive really shows how complex and interconnected all of this is. It's a testament to the commitment of so many people, scientists, regulators, healthcare providers, to constantly learning and adapting to make sure medications are used as safely and effectively as possible.
It's really impressive. And it makes you think, what kind of information or resources related to medication risks would you find most helpful, whether you're a patient, a healthcare provider, or just someone who wants to be more informed about this stuff? It's a conversation that needs to keep happening.
I agree. The more we talk about these issues, the more awareness we raise, and the better equipped everyone will be to make informed decisions about their health.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today. This was a really enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.